Today we are going to, for the Journal Club, we're going to delve into a publication by Louis Pasteur. It was a report to the Academy of Sciences that he made on June 13th in 1881. So just to recap the recent history in terms of Pasteur and Robert Koch and so forth, it was only in 1876 that Robert Koch nailed down the fact that a microbe could cause a disease. And that microbe was the Anthrax Bacillus that would cause anthrax, primarily a disease of livestock, sheep and cattle and so forth. And the thing that was, other people had already discovered the bacteria, the rod or the bacillus, and they'd also found that there were spores that this bacillus would form, but they didn't know that the spores could become active and then cause disease, and that's what Robert Koch showed. And so that was really good for Robert Koch, and it was the beginning of microbiology and the beginning of a whole century of sorting through all these, the entire microbial world, gave job security for all kinds of microbiologists who became microbiologists. So it was only 2 years later that Louis Pasteur then stood up in front of the National Academy in 1878 and introduced, or sort of reintroduced, the germ theory of disease. And he was, basically what he was doing is that he was setting himself up to compete with Robert Koch. He didn't really, this was just sort of a theory presentation. It wasn't really a study about anything. But in that 1878 presentation, he essentially said that, all these contagious diseases, communicable diseases that we have been dealing with over the centuries, both in humans and also in livestock, those things are caused by small living things. There was a theory going around at the time, or had been for years, that there was such a thing as spontaneous generation, and that living things could just spontaneously appear from non-living things. And basically what Pasteur was trying to do is to set that aside and say, that's just not true. You can't do that. So then in 1880, just 2 more years later, Pasteur stood up in front of the National Academy and laid out what a whole new area of science, basically vaccinology. You'll recall that Edward Jenner, almost 100 years previously, had developed a vaccine for smallpox, and he'd done it by observing the fact that, or using the observations of others, that cowpox, a related but different disease for humans, which was self-contained. You could take material from cowpox and immunize people, and they wouldn't get smallpox. So that was known for almost a century. But now in 1880, Louis Pasteur said all these diseases can be dealt with vaccines. And the first one he talked about was chicken cholera. Well, the next one he talked about was anthrax. He's getting right back into Robert Koch's face, or neck of the woods. And basically, he had appeared before the Academy in February of 1881. And the paper we're talking about today was reported on June 13th of 1881. But in February, it actually was on my birthday, February 28th. And so that's why I remember that. But in addition, basically, I was like the 1st of March. 1st of March, 1881, he stands up in front of the Academy and he says, I've developed a vaccine for anthrax, and I've used the same methods that I told you about last year in my vaccine for chicken cholera. And which going back to that whole thing, he basically never told the Academy how he made this vaccine. He kept it secret in a sealed envelope. But what you could do back in those days is that if you wanted to keep your methods and your results secret, but you wanted to establish priority, and I forgot to say this when I talked about this last week, if you wanted to establish priority, you could submit your critical data and so forth to the Academy in a sealed envelope. And therefore, if somebody else came along later, a week or a month or 6 months later, And they've said they really discovered this. You'd already have this sealed envelope submitted on whatever day you had done, and that would establish your priority. It didn't give you, it wasn't as good as a patent. You had to then, in order to take advantage of and gain financial gain from your inventions or your discoveries, but it would give you priority in terms of scientific priority. But in the sealed envelope, ultimately, Louis Pasteur said what his magic formula was for creating the chicken cholera vaccine. And that was simply to culture it over and over and over again in the presence of air, oxygen. And he had hypothesized that cholera was one of the microbes that was sensitive to oxygen and wouldn't grow well. And so it was a way to pressure, to apply pressure to that bug, and what he'd hoped for would it be that it would become changed in some way and it would lose its virulence under this pressure. Well, it turns out that chicken cholera bacillus is a so-called aerobic organism. It loves oxygen. So that was total BS, essentially. His secret sealed envelope invention that he had announced to the Academy in 1880. Well, in 1881, he comes back and he says, I've got a vaccine for anthrax, and I use the same method. Well, it turns out that anthrax is also an aerobic bacillus, loves oxygen. And so that probably also was not going to work, at least the way he thought it was supposed to work. But on the basis of that presentation, it really upset the veterinarians in France. And you have to know France a little bit, because the farmers and the livestock, the food is very important in France, probably over everything else except wine. And so the veterinarians were skeptical that this guy Pasteur, who was a chemist, what's he doing in my ball wax? We don't really trust this guy. And so that was February or 1st of March, really, when he announced to the Academy that he had this anthrax vaccine. But in April, only a month and a half later, the Agricultural Society of Melun, France. Melun was a small town southwest of Paris, about an hour's drive out. And they got together in their agricultural society and they challenged Pasteur to a public experiment of his vaccine. And so they said that they proposed to him, what we'll do is we'll gather up 50 sheep. You can have 20, half of those can be controls and half of them you'll give them your vaccine. And then we'll challenge all 50 of those sheep with virulent anthrax, and we'll see how well your vaccine works. Well, there's a backstory to this whole thing, and that was that because of the fact that Pasteur had said earlier on, back a year and a half earlier in 1880, that vaccines had to be alive to work. And they had to be alive because his theory about how the immune system works or how the animal or the human would become immune would be that the attenuated vaccine, the live attenuated vaccine would deplete the host of vital nutrients that it needed to grow, so that when the virulent bug came along, they couldn't grow in the host anymore. And that's what he thought immunity was. And that was totally wrong. And that's why I've said, is he really the father of immunology? He didn't know what was going on. He didn't have a clue. I mean, he had more than a clue, but even so. In this presentation, Pasteur said to the Academy, they said, "Fortune favors those who are prepared," which is another similar quote that he also was famous for, which was, "Chance favors the prepared mind." Pasteur had a lot of chutzpah. So he signed a contract with the Agricultural Society for the experiment that was going to be performed. And in May, what they did was, on the 5th of May, 1881, they gave their first injection to 25 sheep, and they left 25 as control. They also threw in 10 cows, 6 of which got the vaccine and 4 of which didn't. So that was on the 5th of May. And 2 weeks later, on the 17th of May, they gave them a booster shot. That's sort of familiar to you people that may have already gotten the COVID vaccine boost or shots so far. So on the 5th of May, got the first dose, the 17th of May, got the second dose, and on the 31st of May, they challenged all 50 of these sheep and all of the cattle, all of the cows. And then on the 2nd of June, just 2 days later, everybody converged on the little town and on the pasture where all these animals were grazing and so forth to see the results. And Pasteur had sent one of his lab people down on the day before to find out exactly, to see whether he could get an inkling about what was going on. And the sneak evaluation came back favorably. So Pasteur knew that his experiment had worked. And he had invited everybody that he knew. I mean, more than 200 people had come to see the results of this experiment. A lot of farmers from all around the area to see this thing. Politicians, the mayor, and so forth. The media were there, and the train down from Paris came down, and Pasteur got off the train and went to the pasture. And the thing is, so almost all of the placebo or controlled animals were dead or dying, whereas the vaccinated animals looked fine. It was wonderful. And, and the bands played, and they had the high school bands out there and so forth. So you just can imagine what it was like. And he states in his presentation, which was just on the 13th of June, so it's only 2 weeks later. See, it was much easier back in those days if you were a member of the glitterati and the academy. You could go, a couple of weeks later and present your experiments and your results, and you didn't have to submit it for peer review, your article and so forth, and have it accepted, which would take a year. So anyway, he got in front of the academy, and he said, this was the method we used to develop the chicken cholera vaccine. That it was serial passage of this bug in oxygen. And he said, we had a little trouble because of the spore formation, and we had to fiddle around with different temperatures. And finally we got to a temperature of 42 to 43 degrees centigrade. And that was critical for the development of our attenuation of the bugs and so forth. He goes on and he concludes his presentation by saying that the development of a vaccine against anthrax constitutes significant progress beyond the first vaccine developed by Jenner, since Jenner's vaccine had never been obtained experimentally. It was sort of in nature that it happened to be this cowpox, which was a pox virus, but different enough from smallpox. So, Pasteur was no dummy, that's for sure. And he was basically planting his lance in the ground again by basically saying that I'm even better than Jenner, because now I can develop a vaccine in the laboratory and we can distribute it all over the world, and it's going to be just the best thing since crushed ice. So that's it. That's what that presentation on the 13th of June and the report to the French Academy consists of. And so what I think you should all do really is go to my website and go click on the writing, and then scroll down to 1881, and you'll find that paper, and you can read that paper. But that's not the total story about this whole thing. There's all kinds of things that were going on that I'm not going to talk about today, but you can read about them. And there's a couple of things that suggested reading that, in addition to this paper that's on the website. One is by, I did a review on Louis Pasteur, because I was very interested in him as to how he got to be so famous and so wonderful and so celebrated. And so I read several books and all of his papers and really studied this for quite some time. I put it together in a review article that I published in Frontiers in Immunology in 2012. And the title of this paper is Louis Pasteur, the father of immunology, with a question mark. And I did that because of all the things that I detail in that particular review article. In addition, there's another very, very important book by Louis Pasteur, published in 1995 by a fellow by the name of Gerald Geison, Geison. He was a history professor at Princeton. It turns out that when Pasteur wrote in his will that he didn't want any of his laboratory notebooks to be released to the public until all the members of his family, however long they might live, had died. And it turns out his grandson died, and all of his notebooks, and he had 140 of them, 102 of them were kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and they were sitting there in a vault. And they finally, in the 60s, they were opened up to the public. And somehow around late 60s, early 70s, Gerald Geison, the history professor at Princeton, started going to Paris every summer. That's a good gig if you can get it. And he would sit in the bibliothèque and go through all of Pasteur's notebooks and to try to find out exactly what was done. And so this book has got all kinds of interesting stories that he's been able to discern by looking through, because Pasteur kept detailed notes, but he was very, very secretive. He wouldn't even let members of his laboratory look at his notebooks. And then after he died, he made sure that they weren't released to the public for 100 years, essentially. And so Gerald Geison wrote off his interpretation of all these things that he could find from the primary source material in a book that he published in 1995. And it's called The Private Science of Louis Pasteur, and it's in the Princeton University Press. So those are two suggested readings if you're interested in all this business. Because, you think that back in the old days, or whenever they were, scientists were much more, how should I say it? They were much nicer people. They didn't compete, and they didn't backstab, and they didn't do all of those bad things that we do today. And that's just not true. And I'll stop there. So if you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and sign up for my newsletter, where I'm serializing my new book, which is called The Quest for New Knowledge. You'll find a sign-up link below. Hey, thanks again. It's been great.